During the 1950s, a dreaded disease known as polio spread fear and panic throughout the United States. The polio virus had been afflicting infants and children throughout the 20th century, leaving parents powerless as they watched their children become permanently paralyzed, with some even losing their lives. It was within this climate of fear that Jonas Salk became one of the heroes of the nation, as he developed a vaccine that would help eradicate the disease. Poliomyelitis, also known as infantile paralysis, is a life-threatening disease caused by the polio virus. It is highly contagious and infects primarily children. However, adults are also susceptible. Instead of accepting this dread disease as inevitable, Americans proved their ability to break barriers as they united to defeat polio through their unstinting support of scientists, such as Jonas Salk, mounting a relentless effort to end the debilitating epidemic with one of the most significant vaccine success stories in history. Polio first reared its ugly head in Vermont in 1894. 18 people were left dead and 132 were permanently paralyzed. Just 22 years later, these numbers would increase exponentially. In 1916, in New York City, 27,000 cases of polio were reported, with 6,000 deaths. But the numbers didn't stop there either. In 1952, a record number of over 57,000 polio cases were reported. The most famous victim of polio was the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had contracted the disease in 1921. Suddenly, a disease that was not well understood debilitated a wealthy and powerful politician. FDR's experience with polio proved to people that the virus did not discriminate. Anyone could become infected, no matter their race, gender, and economic or social class. And this fact struck dread into Americans. Largely because of Roosevelt, the national spotlight shifted to a search for a cure or vaccine for polio. Roosevelt himself also took deliberate actions in support of the polio eradication effort. Most importantly, he founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, later known as the March of Dimes, in 1938, which raised funding for polio research one dime at a time. Roosevelt's legacy of the March of Dimes later proved instrumental in the polio eradication campaign.
Judy, when I spend a dime on myself for some little luxury like this, I always think about those unfortunate kids and how far just a dime will go toward helping.
Can I put a dime in your envelope?
Oh, you know that you can. And that's what every good American should do. Join the March of Dimes. Send yours to President Franklin Roosevelt in the White House.
Despite Roosevelt's efforts, the polio epidemic worsened after his death in 1945. Summer was meant to be the time when kids enjoyed playing outside, swimming, and spending time with friends. But not in the 1950s. Summer meant polio season. Parents felt helpless that they couldn't protect their children from permanent paralysis or even death. As people searched for answers, rumors swirled and hysteria grew. Parents did not allow their children to mingle in crowds, swimming pools closed, and children were told to play quietly, as sweating was thought to increase the risk of polio. Even the federal government placed restrictions on commerce and travel in an attempt to reduce polio transmission. Two expressions came to symbolize the polio epidemic: isolation and iron lung. Public health officials quarantined individuals with polio, sometimes forcibly. This resulted in the creation of isolation hospitals, where thousands of polio patients were shut away. In these hospitals, the use of a device called the iron lung became standard practice, which was used in cases of polio where the patient was unable to breathe due to muscle damage. The iron lung, created in 1927, is a metal cylinder that forces air in and out of the patient's lungs, thus allowing for artificial respiration. The iron lung could provide temporary or permanent breathing support for polio patients. Instead of enjoying their youth, children spent their time immobile, laying in a machine that forced every breath for them. These impacts on victims increased pressure on the medical field to come up with a solution. In 1947, Dr. Jonas Salk was recruited by the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine to establish a virus research laboratory and to study the polio virus. Previously, Salk had been researching influenza and eventually developed a flu vaccine that contained the killed influenza virus in 1943. Later on, when Salk began his work with polio, he thought this same killed virus principle that worked with influenza could be utilized to create a polio vaccine. He also hypothesized that using the killed virus would be safer, as it would eliminate any risk of accidentally inoculating a person with polio. Other scientists also contribute significantly to the research on polio. In 1949, John Enders, Thomas Weller, and Frederick Robbins developed a method of growing the poliovirus in tissue culture, which paved the way for Salk to develop his vaccine. In 1952, all these efforts came to fruition. Salk and his associates succeeded in developing a safe polio vaccine. To ensure that as many children as possible could have access to the vaccine, Salk decided against seeking to patent his work.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
Once the vaccine was developed, human field trials began. The vaccine was first injected into children who already had polio. Then, in 1954, a massive field trial sponsored by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis was launched. Almost 2 million U.S. children between the ages of 6 and 9 participated. These children became known as the polio pioneers. Half of the polio pioneers were given the vaccine, while the other half were given a placebo. On April 12, 1955, Thomas Francis, Salk's mentor and the director of the trial, made the announcement that the American people had all been waiting for.
The vaccine could be considered 80 to 90% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
The American people were beyond grateful that the killer disease had finally been defeated. While Salk was developing his vaccine, a scientist named Albert Sabin had been working on his own. Sabin made an oral version of the vaccine using the weakened live virus, believing it would be easier to administer and more efficient. However, Sabin's vaccine did not get much support in the US because the Salk vaccine was already being used. Thus, Albert Sabin turned to his native Soviet Union for help and was allowed to conduct field trials there in 1957. Once the Soviet trials ended in 1960, the U.S. Public Health Service approved the vaccine for manufacture in 1961. Sabin's vaccine later replaced Salk's in many parts of the world, mainly because it was easier to administer. Through the use of both the Salk and Sabin vaccines, polio was eliminated in the United States by 1979 and eradicated from the Western Hemisphere by 1991. Today, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, which is the largest private-public partnership for health, has reduced polio cases by 99%. Polio only affects a few of the world's poorest regions, in countries such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria, where polio still haunts the most vulnerable children. While the polio vaccine is celebrated as one of the most important medical feats in history, the campaign still works to ensure that every last child is vaccinated and a polio-free world is guaranteed for future generations. Even though scientists broke numerous medical barriers while developing the polio vaccine, most importantly, the American people demonstrated their ability to break barriers when they united around a shared purpose. People looked past their differences to fight for a cause larger than themselves. The virus did not care about political affiliations, economic disparities, and social differences. Polio could infect anyone. For this reason, solidarity was integral to the polio success story. The U.S. has throughout history struggled to unify its population, and still does today. But in the 1950s, the American people were able to break this long-standing barrier. The March of Dimes became the symbol of this American indivisibility, playing a leading role in raising public awareness about polio and showing people that they could make a difference a dime at a time. Together, Americans helped raise over $67 million. In addition, medical barriers were broken as pharmaceutical companies worked closely with scientists to produce the vaccine on a mass scale, something that had not been possible before. Arguably, the most important unity was within the international community. While the United States was the first country to develop the polio vaccine, it was by no means the only one to benefit. Polio eradication was, and still is, a global effort. Today, the vast majority of children walk in a polio-free world because of these barriers that were broken in the 20th century.